Okay, so welcome back. Really brief review. So we've been talking about objectivity in science, the relationship between having a perspective and being a scientist, the question of values and science, and we sort of, I hope that I've convinced you that the scientific process is not what Grinnell's been calling the linear model, that is the sort of just plain, steady accumulation of simple facts that don't come from any perspective and that you don't need to sort of think about their process by which they're generated or who generated them or anything like that. We talked about the sort of different, so that would be like the first type of umpire. There's just sort of an observation as a purely objective, completely transparent process. We talked a little bit about this sort of notion of science and social power. We'll come back a little bit to this when we talk about social construction. So I think we got a whole week where we're talking about specifically about social construction, what it means for something to be socially constructed. I mean, scientific facts are a product of a social process. That is, you can't just do science by yourself, basically. You need somebody else in conversation with you to sort of help you examine your biases and look at things in different ways. But that's not to say that it's not in any sense objective. So like money's a social construct too, and that's pretty real, right? It's pretty clearly a real thing. You don't get to sort of pretend it doesn't exist. It's very much a fact, and there are facts about money. So we have a whole science called economics that studies how money behaves, and there are sort of laws and generalities that you can extract about its behavior. So just because it's a social construct doesn't mean it's not real, doesn't mean it doesn't follow rules, doesn't mean it can't be rationally justified. So Grinnell's trying to convince us that science is more like the second type of umpire. That is, I call them like I see them. It's not that scientific facts are purely objective, and it's not like they're purely made up either. They are facts produced from a perspective, and scientists do their level best, except when they're actually fraudulent, which we talked about a little last time. The actual, like, assuming a good faith attempt to represent the world, science is like the second type of umpire. That's more or less where we got, yeah? So we've been doing this as a kind of broad overview. So the first week was, or the sort of first week we dealt with Grinnell, we were trying to talk about this as an overall model. Now we're gonna zoom in for this week on the kind of discovery cycle. So the relationship between individual scientists and the world. That's the sort of topic today. I mean, it's familiar, but we'll get into more depth on it. That's the plan, yeah? Okay, so we'll talk a bit about discovery. And let's start off by talking a bit about why discovery is considered important, and specifically getting credit for your discovery. So this is kind of the lifeblood of an individual scientist. To make it in the scientific community, to remain part of it, you get credit for that discovery, yeah? Like, this is a Nobel Prize, which is the most famousest way of getting credit. Of course, there are many degrees of credit. Just getting a publication is a kind of credit. So, I mean, you don't really get credit until your claim. So, in this cycle, so the individual scientist does some studying, they make a claim, which then sort of gets fed into this credibility cycle. So you really don't get credit until the community has accepted that what you've said is a real thing. But once you have, you get credit for it. And Grinnell says he thinks most scientists are kind of intrinsically interested in this. They want to have discovered something important about the world, and they would like for people to know that it was them. I mean, that's, to contribute to the sum of human knowledge is considered something worthwhile in its own right. And it's why a lot of people go into science. Again, when we talked about fraud, like, if you're just there to make money, there are way better ways to just make money or get famous or whatever. Like, there's way easier ways to get sort of social and economic recognition. Scientists seem to be motivated by A, making the discovery, and B, having it be known that they personally sort of helped add to the sum of human knowledge. That's a sort of nice and noble way of putting this, but there's also a kind of more I don't want to say serious, a little more cutthroat reason why they want the credit. And it's because getting credit for your scientific discoveries is what lets you stay in the community. It's what lets you continue to be a scientist. Because scientists who don't produce anything don't get to keep doing science. That's unfortunately the way the sort of system, well, fortunately or unfortunately, is the way the system is set up. So getting credit for your scientific discoveries helps you secure funding to do more research. It helps you secure research positions, so getting a job at a university or at a corporation where you're allowed to do research. Ultimately, it means you get to do things like run your own laboratory, your own research team. So the promotion of people into those positions and the funding that keeps them there, that's all based on the credit you've received for past discoveries. So it's, there's this intrinsically motivating thing, and there's also this thing where if you don't contribute, you don't get to stay, basically. So this is why scientists are pretty interested in getting credit for their discoveries. There's some really nice episodes of this in the history of science. So here's one. So, if you ask anybody who discovered or who came up with a theory of evolution by natural selection, practically everyone will say Darwin. Did you know that there was another guy? Yeah.
Well, so leading up to Darwin's discovery, there were people working before him that came up with similar ideas, and then he kind of built.
Sure. Sure, absolutely. So that's going to be true of basically any scientific discovery. It's always an iterative process. It's always a process of slowly building on past ideas. So for example, Darwin's idea heavily borrowed from Lamarck. So Lamarck had this idea that species have this sort of built-in process of change and that they will slowly change over time. He didn't have the mechanism. So the mechanism that Darwin suggests, which is natural selection. So why is it so that he observed this really interesting thing about species? They seem to have bodies that really nicely fit the kind of way they make their way in the world. So fish are really well adapted for swimming, and birds are really well adapted for flying. And you can get down, those are the broad strokes, but you can get down into really intimate detail on an animal's body and go, wow, this thing is really, really nicely fitted to the exact environment in which it exists. And why is that? Darwin's the one who came up with the idea that, in a population there will be variation. Some animals will be more fitted to their environment than others. Those animals that are more fitted were more likely to get their genes into the next generation. Darwin didn't know about genes, by the way. He just knew that there was heritability, like parents and children resemble each other, and therefore the more fitted you are, the more children you're likely to, or relatives you're likely to get into the next generation. So the next generation is going to be slightly more fitted to its environment. So Lamarck had this idea of species changing over time. Darwin's the one who filled in the mechanism for exactly how they change over time. He drew on Lamarck, he drew on Thomas Malthus, who pointed out that there's this sort of most species will reproduce geometrically. So we have two kids, and those two kids have two kids, and those two kids have two kids, and they'll sort of expand exponentially, but the carrying capacity of any environment is limited, so there's always going to be this sort of fight for resources. So this kind of Malthusian trap. Anyway, okay, so Darwin's got lots of inputs. There was also this guy, Alfred Russel Wallace. So Darwin's working away for 20 years on his theory of natural selection. He's amassing enormous amounts of research and evidence and putting it all together in this very careful, meticulous way without telling anybody about it. And then he gets this letter from a guy, Alfred Russel Wallace. Darwin's a kind of well-established, socially important English dude. And Wallace is off in the colonies. So there's this huge colonial project of going out into the, British people would go out into the world and do a little ransacking, that's what they do, what they did. and sort of collect, especially biological samples. So the flora and fauna of the world were being kind of collected and categorized and brought back to Britain. Rich people would have these like very elaborate collections of sort of dead animals and plants and stuff. And so Wallace is engaged in this project. He's kind of a lowly, like, you know, out there working the fields, getting samples, that kind of thing. He writes Darwin a letter. He says, hey, I got this really cool idea, evolution by natural selection. He basically produces Darwin's theory of natural selection after Darwin does, but before Darwin's published it. And Darwin says, he could not have made a better short abstract, even his terms now stand as heads of my chapters. He does not say he wishes me to publish, but I shall, of course, at once write and offer to send to any journal. So Darwin's relatively nice about this. So both of these guys really want credit for coming up with possibly the best scientific theory of the 19th century. Darwin very nicely sort of shares credit for it. So what he does is goes to the Royal Society, which at that time was the sort of most prestigious scientific society in England. Darwin, kind of shortly after receiving this letter, he realizes he needs to hustle if he's going to get credit for his discovery. He reads out his own theory, and then immediately afterwards, sorry, it's not him, but one of his colleagues sort of reads out his theory and then reads out Wallace's version of it so that they get co-credit in some sense. So they shared credit. At the very beginning, they share credit for coming up with the theory of natural selection. So that's nice. Hands up if you've heard of Wallace before. Okay. Hands up if you've heard of Darwin before. Okay, so it didn't stick. It didn't quite stick that they get to share equally the credit for this. And to be fair, Darwin's didn't just come up with this mechanism. He had huge amounts of evidence sort of accumulated. So all kinds of examples of all of the different sort of like ways in which evolution can work. So it's not like Darwin it's not just that they duplicated exactly the same work, but the idea of the mechanism, they get sort of shared credit. So this is an example of Darwin acting well. He's doing the right thing by somebody kind of scoops him, and he very nicely sort of shares credit. He could have buried this guy. Like, he absolutely had the social status and prestige to like deny that he ever got the letter, publish it himself, pretend he'd never heard of him. Partly the fact that Darwin had a better social position means that we credit Darwin. So Darwin was more central in British society. He had more social power. He had more famous friends. Wallace is kind of a nobody. Yeah, so that's a nice example of sharing credit in science, which is given the both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation to get credit, this is a really nice thing to see. There's unfortunately not always people sharing credit. In fact, there's kind of an issue with people stealing credit, straight up stealing it. So there's been, so this is from 2008, Iranian paper sparks sense of deja vu. The sense of deja vu is because the paper was literally just stitched together from other people's papers. So there's been kind of a rash of these things. This is another form of scientific misconduct, scientific fraud, where people just, it's not even that they're making up data, they're straight up plagiarizing other people's ideas and trying to get them published. And the scientific literature at this point is so large that there's really no way for anybody to check. Like, so when you're looking at a paper, it's really hard to like look at literally all of the other papers to see whether it's been plagiarized. So these people do get caught, but it's hard to catch them. And I mean, I had a professor when I was an undergrad who did this really terrifying plagiarism speech that sort of indicating that although it is a pain in the butt to sort of put people through the process when you catch them plagiarizing, he's perfectly happy to do it because all that academics have in the world is our ideas. Like that's literally how I pay my rent and buy food, is the words that I say and the ideas that I come up with. So if you steal them, you're taking away the only thing I've got. And That's true of scientists. That's true of philosophers as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Not, it's kind of on this thing, because there is on occasion, two people working in similar fields and that kind of stuff, and coming up with very similar or the exact same idea.
Sure.
Without knowing about the other person.
Sure.
How would the scientific community kind of deal, I guess, with that, if you would know, or like,
So.
Is it technically plagiarism or anything along those?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So if you've got two people doing independent research on the same subject and they both come up with the same idea, that's actually the best case for science. That's a replication. So that's how the scientific method is sold. Lots of different people, and I just started this off by being like, you can't be a scientist by yourself. You need people to check your results. So lots of different people working on the same thing, coming up with the same answers independently of each other is actually really good news. The catch there is the incentive structure in publishing. So there's this kind of perverse incentive structure where only novel results are regarded as more valuable and therefore more publishable. It's really hard to just publish something, like if somebody does an experiment and gets a result, and somebody afterwards reads that and says, I'm going to do that again just to make sure, that replication is almost certainly not going to get published. So it's not so if you genuinely did it independently, that's not considered a problem. It's not considered plagiarism. Same thing with your essays, by the way. If you come up with an idea that somebody else came up with already, but you did it by yourself, that is not considered plagiarism. That's perfectly fine. Nobody can know everything that's going on. However, in the scientific publishing world, what journals want is to attract prestige to themselves so that they can be big, important journals. The way that you do that is by publishing novel results, because novel results get cited, and citation counts are the metric of how important you are in the scientific world. So how many people use your paper as part of their further research. And that means that something that's not novel, generally speaking, won't get published. So it's good that it's in some broad intellectual sense, it's very good if two groups of scientists come up with the same result. But in a practical sense, there's a sort of strong disincentive to do that, because the more novel your result is, the better a journal. So there's also kind of a social hierarchy of journals. Not all journals are considered equal. So to get your paper into a big famous journal like Nature or Science, you have to have a novel result, and having somebody else having already published on it means your result is not as novel. This is something that seems to be where the way that we actually run science seems to differ from the way you might ideally want it to go. And it's something that is being discussed. We talked last time about how there are a bunch of serious problems with the ways that science is done today. And I don't think that that's sort of a criticism of the science itself, because scientists are talking about this stuff and trying to figure out how we can deal with them. So one of the ways that we deal with this is open there's a bunch of online repositories. So this thing about trying to get into a prestigious journal is kind of an artifact of back when information had to be, they had to take a tree and crush it up and lay it out flat and put ink on it. That's not really the case anymore, right? So now there's these big online archives of preprints, which are like unpublished journal articles. They haven't been through the credibility process, but you can get your ideas out there. Anyway, so that's trying to do something with that is one of the proposals for dealing with this kind of weird incentive structure that you get, where like everybody wants replications, but nobody's publishing them.
Before the internet,
No.
Academics and scientists sort of had like a monopoly on data.
That's right.
So like there are people,
Well, a certain kind of data.
Yeah. There are people
Yeah.
who have analyzed the bourgeoisie and the role that they play in society, and they see how like many people who are in that class in society would end up studying like arts and culture.
Uh-huh.
And now that all that information is effectively available on the internet, it renders what they were doing obsolete.
So you mean the journals?
Well, not more than just the journals, but like the person itself is a repository for information.
Right, right.
And
So you're saying I'm obsolete? Is that the
Not-
claim?
not
Okay,
necessarily,
okay.
but, well-
No, I think you're right that the role of, for example, higher education has got to be shifting because the amount of information available at any given time keeps going up and up. So my job here can't be to tell you all the information that's available. My job has to be to teach you how to navigate the available information, give you principles and stuff like that. Yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah. All right, so stealing credit, it's bad. Don't do that. There's also, so again, in this sort of, there's a huge pressure for people to get published because that's the kind of credit that you use to keep your career going. And there's this class of what they call predatory journals emerging to sort of take advantage of that. Yeah?
So I was just curious, what kind of consequences can you face for stealing like people's ideas?
Oh, for plagiarism?
In the academic world? Like, would you just be like discredited or like what would happen?
So this credit that you've built up is your ticket to continuing to participate in the field. And when you've been accused of academic misconduct and somebody notices, all that credit goes away. So basically you don't get to be a scientist anymore. I think it's not actually illegal. I think you can't go to jail for publishing phony results or doing plagiarism. Just like, I mean, like you can't in university, like there's no chance of going to jail for plagiarism. However, the kind of academic credit that you're trying to build up, sometimes literal academic credits, those can be taken away. Your sort of credibility with the institution. So this is all based on trust and credibility, and that's the currency that can be taken away from you. Yeah, and it's really like, you know, it's not like you get set up once and then you're just coasting. I guess it probably was like this like in the 70s where like, you know, you get a fancy science job and they just don't really check whether you're doing anything for 30 years and you can just tinker away in a basement. I'm sure that was the case at some very moneyed institutions for a while. It is not like that anymore because if you are not, so now, if you're not publishing stuff, if you're not continuing to build and maintain the kind of credit you get for having done something, you're kind of out. You're always chasing grants. You're always chasing, like, trying to make sure your position is secure. So that kind of thing. So they kick you out of the discipline, I think is the worst thing that can happen. And they publish mean articles about you in Nature, and maybe if it's bad enough, you make the news, that kind of thing. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Is it the same in like privatized institutions as it is in like a university?
How so? Like,
If you're making glue at DuPont, is
right.
it the same as like trying to discover what how it works or something like that?
So I don't know nearly as much about that. So the funny thing about, okay, so I don't know. Let me just blanket that. I don't really know. I think that they have a different way of assessing results. So in science, the way that you build up credibility is getting publications in prestigious journals. And it's a kind of like how many publications you got times how fancy the journal is. And the journals are fancier, mostly they're fancier when their acceptance to rejection rate is higher, so there's more rejections to acceptances. So like Nature rejects like 95% of the papers that get sent there. So number of publications times fanciness of journal times number of times those articles are cited by other people, which shows that they're making an impact on the discourse. If you're making glue at DuPont, if you make good glue, that's it. I think that's it. Again, I really don't know, but my impression is that this stuff doesn't matter nearly so much. Although there's a lot of science, a lot of research going on that's sort of public-private partnerships. So that kind of, if it's basic research, there's a really good chance it's going on in a university in partnership with a corporation. So a lot of the money, so we've been talking about chasing grants. One of the places grants comes from is government. Sometimes it comes direct from universities. A lot of the money is coming from companies. who are interested in having that basic research done. So there's a kind of really complex nexus of what kind of credibility you've got, where it's coming from, who cares about the kind that you've got. So yeah.
A lot of private companies would actually be interested in keeping that whenever they discover a secret. That way their company has a competitive edge.
Sure. Yeah, so there's a lot of proprietary information in the private world. Yeah.
Like oil companies, the researchers at oil companies figured out that climate change was happening way before anybody else, and then kept it a secret.
Yeah. So there's all that. Right. So. Okay. So. These poor scientists working their hearts out to establish credit for having made scientific discoveries, and now there are literally hundreds of these predatory journals. These are pay-to-play journals where the author pays to publish in the journal, which is a slightly worse deal than the regular journals where there's no money exchanged. I don't know if you know this, but like when you get published in a journal, they don't pay you at all. You just offer up the sum of your life's work to them, and then they make money off of publishing it. These ones are even worse, where the authors pay to get published, and then, I mean, if it's a predatory journal, what that means is that they're really not checking whether it was a good paper or not, so they'll publish kind of anything. The prestige of these journals is very low. So people you don't accumulate much credit for doing it, but you gotta publish something, you gotta publish it somewhere, and publishing in a predatory journal is apparently considered slightly better than not publishing at all in some contexts. So there's this sort of there's this small industry of really unscrupulous people preying on the desperate hope of scientists to get published somewhere, anywhere. Anyway, so so there's the notion of credit in scientific research. We want it. And we talk about government providing a bunch of funding. So in Canada, one of the biggest granting agencies for scientific research is NSERC, National Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. They give about $500 million per year. And what you do as a scientist is you write a grant application. You write them a proposal. You say, I am famous scientist X. I have this project that I want to write. Give me money. And this is like something like half of a working scientist's day is spent doing grant applications or something like that rather than science. So there's huge amounts of effort, huge amounts of competition for this grant money. And so here are the criteria that they get into a lot more detail, but here's basically how they judge whether they're going to give you the grant so you can do the research or not. They have to, so these three are equally weighted. Scientific or engineering excellence of the researcher is weighted about equally with merit of the proposal and contribution to the training of highly qualified personnel. So there's the kind of three-way split between how fancy are you? That is, how much credibility, how much credit for discovery have you built up as a principal researcher? How good your proposal is. And, I mean, kind of nicely, they're asking for you to show that the people working for you, so you're the principal investigator, you're the main person in the research group, you've got a whole bunch of other people, so junior scientists early in their career, postdocs, graduate students, sometimes undergraduate students, who are all themselves trying to accumulate credit for having made scientific discoveries. So you're bringing a whole group of people along with you. So if you were wondering, like, okay, I don't get to do research unless I've got credit, I don't get credit unless I do research, how do I get in here? The way that you get in is by being a junior researcher, so doing the kind of technical workaday stuff that sort of makes up a scientific study. So this is about a third. Like, show me that you're bringing people along with you. It's only a third how good your proposal actually is. So if you're wondering, like, can I just off the street, if I have a brilliant scientific idea, I've got no formal education, but I've cracked something really important and I want to do a study. Is the government going to give me money for it? No, because you haven't got 2 out of the 3 of these. You need credibility before you get the money, basically. So that's something to consider. Yeah, okay. All right, so that's why we want to make discoveries. Let's talk a little bit more about discovery in particular. Grinnell is very interested in the notion of accidental discovery, the fact that many scientific discoveries happen by accident. So we talked last time about Viagra. Here's another in the kind of pharmacomedical world. Albert Hofmann was looking at derivatives from ergot. So a long time ago, ergot is this fungus that gets into rye, and people would like eat bread infected with this, and like their arms would fall off and they'd die. It was terrible. It was a really terrible disease. But it turns out that if you take tiny, tiny, tiny amounts of ergot, it can actually be helpful for things like inducing childbirth and other things like that. So they were doing research on like, what if I shift some molecules around on ergot? What'll that do? They were looking for things which would help improve circulation. And Hofmann produced at least 25 of these different derivatives. Sort of in 1938, he produced what's called LSD-25. You might have heard of it. They kind of gave up on it pretty quickly. They gave it to a bunch of animal subjects, and they were like, "Wow, those animals are acting weird." They got real twitchy and excited, but they didn't see improved circulation. So like, that's not what we're looking for. That was not the goal. Around 5 years later, Hofmann resynthesizes it, and he's just working with it one day, and he starts feeling dizzy and weird. So he goes home, and then the next day he's like, what was that? He's like, maybe it's the solvents I'm working with. So he like intentionally breathes some of the solvents to see if that did it. That wasn't it. So I'm like, I guess I must have been exposed to a little bit of this LSD-25. So he intentionally dosed himself with a little bit of it. Now his plan was to take such a hilariously tiny amount that it wouldn't do anything. So he's like, okay, I'm gonna take such a crazy small amount. It's for sure not gonna do anything. So he took 250 micrograms, which if you're familiar is about 2.5 hits of acid. And he got really spun. He had to go home. He rode his bike home. There's lots of pictures on the internet of Albert Hofmann's famous bike ride home. So he discovered something of substantial scientific interest by accident, basically. Certainly wasn't the thing that he was looking for. And there's a moment in this story, what I think this story is interesting, it's a slightly fun story, there's a moment in this story where they synthesized this stuff. They tried it on animal subjects. And then they decided it wasn't what they were looking for. So they put it on the shelf. So this is the difference between, so this is the kind of accidental quality of discovery, and the fact that a scientist needs to be at least a little open to seeing things that they weren't looking for, right? So your hypothesis frames your experiment. I'm trying to discover whether X is true. Does this stuff improve circulation? And Grinnell's sort of, this one wasn't one of his examples, but he's very interested in the fact that very often, this is a big famous one, Viagra's a big famous one, but very often scientific discoveries are the result of not finding what you're looking for, but just finding something else, finding something that you didn't expect to see. And so if you've got this picture of the scientific method where, this is nowhere in the science fair model of science, right? You have a hypothesis, you test your hypothesis, it's either true or false at the end. There's no like, oh, and by the way, something completely out of the left field happened, and I thought it was really interesting, and now I'm gonna do research on that instead. Yeah.
It is talked about in economics though. So ideas are considered a factor of production in the economy.
Sorry, what is talked about in economics?
Ideas. So scientists.
They talk about ideas in economics.
Yeah, well, yeah. No, okay. So researchers play a role in the economy, and by producing new ideas, they stimulate the economy and allow for economic growth. And then those ideas, in addition to the purpose of they play, they also have positive externalities. And
I see.
You create
I
an
see.
equation
Yeah. Yeah.
that measures the utility of the ideas as well as the positive externalities of those new ideas.
Right, so side effects. They talk about the side effects of idea protection. Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so Grinnell talks about this as the problem of noticing. In the case of Viagra and the case of LSD, that problem of noticing is pretty easy. Like if you took 250 micrograms of LSD, you would notice. It's not the sort of thing that escapes your attention. But that's really not always the case. Very often noticing is hard because you're in a hypothesis, you're in some framework, you've framed your research in some way, and your attention becomes kind of laser focused on that thing. And it's very easy to miss things that are potentially really interesting and relevant, but which don't fit into your hypothesis. So he uses this example from Sherlock Holmes. Is there any point to which you wish to draw my attention? And Holmes says, to the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. The dog did nothing in the dog did nothing in the nighttime. That was the curious incident, remarked Sherlock Holmes. So somebody had broken into a house and the dog didn't bark. And if somebody unfamiliar had broken into the house, the dog would bark. Holmes induces, it's not a deduction. He inductively comes up with the idea that this was somebody familiar that had broken into the house. So this is a piece of evidence, but it's a piece of evidence that is hard to notice, right? Notice that the dog didn't freak out when this person came into the house, that kind of thing. So this is supposed to be an example of Holmes being really good at noticing things. Yeah? Okay. Briefly, let me talk about, so this problem of noticing, this problem of being able to adaptively shift hypotheses is one which traditional philosophy of science has not really paid much attention to. So here's a question: where does your hypothesis come from? This is from Karl Popper's The Logic of Scientific Discovery. This is, if you know the notion of falsification. So what makes science science-y? It's falsification. That was this guy. This guy is one of the most important. I mean, this is one of the people who did philosophy of science that gets most taken up by scientists themselves of any that I can think of. He's one of the most important philosophers of science in history. Here's what he has to say about where hypotheses come from. The initial stage, the act of conceiving or inventing a theory, seems to be neither to call for logical analysis nor to be susceptible of it. The question of how it happens that a new idea occurs to a man, whether it is a musical theme, a dramatic conflict, or a scientific theory, may be of great interest to empirical psychology, but is irrelevant to the logical analysis of scientific knowledge. So this is kind of the traditional view in science, in philosophy of science anyway, that the initial hypothesis, and they did this to you in the science fair too, right? Just come up with a hypothesis. Doesn't matter where, doesn't matter how. That's not part of the process. And for Popper, the important thing was, given a hypothesis, given some evidence, what makes it the case that the evidence supports or falsifies the hypothesis? So that was the part that he thought was most kind of epistemically important. So distinguish epistemology from psychology. So psychology is like, how do we actually think? Epistemology is how we should think, right? So what makes a bit of reasoning good or effective or justified? And Popper's trying to do the epistemology of science. For him, doesn't matter where the hypothesis comes from. That's not involved in the process. But Grinnell is kind of pushing back against that, saying like, no, look, if you want to understand science, you also have to understand where hypotheses come from and the way in which hypotheses have to sort of shift as the research moves forward. So Grinnell's main example in this chapter is something that happened to him, and it's the example of cell adhesion. So this is, the details of this don't matter too much if you don't do a lot of biochemistry, but so he's a young early career researcher looking to make his mark, and he wants his job, his assigned task is the following: analyze changes in the cellular levels of citric acid in rat liver cells. Really big picture stuff, you know? Okay. But as a kind of practical matter, he's having trouble. So to do this analysis, he got to get the cells to stick to petri dishes. They have to adhere to the glass. If they're just floating around, he can't do his analysis. So he's doing all of this sort of like practical, technical work, trying to get them to stick and trying to figure out what makes them stick or not stick. And halfway through this research, he realizes that there is a kind of different hypothesis floating around in the background here. So there's a different question he could be asking about the exact same system. So it's still rat liver cells, it's still in petri dishes, he's doing the same kind of analysis, but what if he just switches his question from citric acid, like what's the effect of citric acid on these cells, to what makes these cells stick together? It's a pretty biologically important phenomena. Notice the way that you don't fall apart into a liquid mush. That's because your cells stick together. There's cell adhesion between them, right? So the very fact that we are not goo is a result of cell adhesion. It's an incredibly important biological fact. So he switches halfway through from the question of citric acid, the response to citric acid, to questions about cell adhesion. He makes some really nice discoveries about this. So this is something that he's obviously very proud of. Some of his best scientific work happened because he was working on one question, and then another kind of more interesting question, just as a matter of the practicalities of lab work, came up. And he makes this very risky move. So this is a profoundly risky move that for him paid off. He says, look, I think I found a more interesting question, a more interesting thing to analyze. And he goes to the more senior researchers that he's working under and says, is this a thing? And they talk to their friends. And as it turned out, there was a kind of fresh, burgeoning new literature on cell adhesion. So this was a topic that other people were working on, which made it possible for him to, I hate this term, but pivot from one question to the other. Yeah, he was able to kind of reorient his whole research program. And the reason why, so like why was he allowed to do that? In general, you're not allowed to just be like, you know what, I don't think I want to research this thing that you got a grant for. I'm going to research this other thing that nobody's talking about or thinking about. That's typically not how it works. For him, it did work this way because there was another, what we might call experimental paradigm, already kind of emerging. So he's switching from one set of questions, hypotheses, methods, to another set. And it just happens to be that he was working in one set of questions, one set of hypotheses, one set of methods, and he found something really juicy and interesting that would fit into a different research program. And he was able to hop from one to the other because, so he tells it in the chapter, which I hope you'll read. He talks to his advisor talks to other scientists and those other scientists say, yes, this is a credible research question. Yes, this is a thing that we're talking about. Yes, this is a thing that's worth studying. Yeah? So this question of what's worth studying pretty much always gets framed within a paradigm, within some framework. And there was another one for him to hop to. So, okay, so here's a weird one. Here's some philosophy about this stuff. Here's Plato trying to prove that you can't learn anything. It's called Meno's paradox, paradox of discovery. A man cannot search either for what he knows or for what he does not know. He cannot search for what he knows, since he knows it. There's no need to search. Nor for what he does not know, for he does not know what to look for. So, trying to learn something new, either you already know it, in which case you can't learn anything new, or you don't know what you're looking for, in which case you can't learn anything about it because you don't know what you're looking for. Therefore, learning is impossible. So you can all go home. Saved you a lot of tuition today. Haha. Okay. No. Okay. So obviously this is not true. I'm going to go right out and say that we know better than Plato. We do learn stuff. We learn stuff because discovery is not all or nothing. It's a kind of slow process where we kind of half know stuff. we can put labels on things that we don't understand. We can see a phenomenon and go, whoa, that's weird. I don't know what that is. You label it with an X. So the name X-rays comes from somebody being like, wow, that's super weird. We'll put an X on it. They literally just said whatever that is. And then, of course, now we understand X-rays very well because we had a couple centuries of studying them. So my favorite example of this is dark matter, dark energy. Familiar with this? So in astronomy, galaxies behaved very oddly. So we have really good models how galaxies should move over time. And it looked like they were missing something like 90% of their mass. So they're behaving as though they're 10 times heavier than anything that we can account for in terms of the stars and planets and nebula in there. So that's just a humongous anomaly, a difference between our observations and our theories. And you might think, well, I don't know how do we deal with that? How can we even begin to think about that? And what they did was stick a label on our ignorance, basically. So, we'll call it dark matter. And similarly with dark energy. So the universe seems to be expanding for no apparent reason. There was a long debate about whether the universe was, so it's expanding, but is it slowing down? If it was just gravity, you'd think it would slow down over time. And would it slow down and then collapse again? Or would it reach a steady state? Turns out it's accelerating. Nobody knows why. So we call it dark energy. But now that you've stuck a label on your ignorance, you can start to study it. You can start to do research on it. So they're now making maps of, dark energy is still very weird, but they're starting to make maps of dark matter, where they think it is, how it's distributed in the universe. So we still have no idea what dark matter is, no idea what dark energy is, but we can at least have a name for our ignorance, showing that Plato was wrong. Like, we don't know what we're looking for, but we've got a name for it, and we're on the trail of it. Sorry, we got like 2 minutes left. So the point I want to end with here is just that paradigms that we've been talking about. So I'll talk more about paradigms on Wednesday, and we'll talk more about it when we talk about Kuhn. But paradigms act as a kind of temporary solution to the problem of noticing. They give you some guidance about what to look for, but you can't treat them as though they're the answer to the problem of noticing, right? They tell you something about what's relevant and what's irrelevant, but that really only works if you already know what you're looking for. Most science is conducted inside a paradigm where they know what they're looking for. But of course, we shift from paradigm to paradigm. Sometimes the paradigm is inadequate. Sometimes we need an entirely new one, that kind of thing. Okay, so we'll think about this. Paradigms as a kind of stopgap solution, temporary solution to the problem of noticing. We'll talk more about discovery on Wednesday. Okay, thanks everyone.